Thank you very much. So as you can tell by the title of the talk, I'm going to be talking to you about a language that's really on the outskirts of Central Asia. But it is my hope that the puzzle that I introduce here will highlight connections and commonalities with some of the phenomena and languages we'll see elsewhere during the conference. So without further ado, here we go. Oh, it's not. Sorry about that. It stopped responding to me. It's not responding at all. Oh, there we go. So, here we are. This work falls under the broader umbrella of a bigger project whose goal is to take a more intuitive approach to Turkish verbal morphology. And so the talk itself is really about a relatively extra theoretical question. And this is really a matter of when you look at the Turkish verbal projection, and what I mean by that is starting with the verb, all the affixes you get all the way out to through tense, aspect, and modality until you're at agreement. Really what types of meaning, what varieties of meaning go in which baskets. So the question here is which suffixes contribute which varieties of meaning. Why I wanted to talk about it at ConCALL is that I would like to see what people from an aerial or historical perspective might have to say about one such problem. So the meaning at hand here is viewpoint aspect, which I'm going to be referring to as simply aspect throughout the talk. And the narrow goal itself is to answer the question of why it is that the Turkish past tense suffix d and the indirect evidential suffix mış convey one variety of viewpoint aspect when they follow a bare verb root, that being perfective aspect, but a different variety of viewpoint aspect, imperfective aspect, in all other contexts. In those contexts I'll be referring to as post-copular for syntactic reasons, which I'll get to. So briefly, a review of perfective versus imperfective aspect. The traditional approach I have illustrated here in diagrams, but I like the definition that Göksel and Kerslake give in their 2005 Grammar of Turkish, and that's that perfective aspect presents an event as a completed whole where you can identify its beginning and its end point. So here we have an arbitrary reference time, and the event referred to by whatever utterance we're concerned with is contained, properly contained within that arbitrary reference time. So an example from English would be something like Ali made yogurt. If you say Ali made yogurt, it's entailed that Ali actually made some yogurt. But if you say Ali was making yogurt, it's not necessarily the case that he succeeded in producing any yogurt. That's because that sentence has imperfective viewpoint aspect. So back to Turkish. I like to have this diagram up here because it really illustrates that we're really at the tip of a morphosyntactic iceberg here when we talk about the viewpoint aspect in Turkish. So basic data, finite d and mış. D being simple past tense and mış being indirect evidentiality. So here in 1 is the finite post-verbal instance. So Hande anlamış, Hande apparently understood. Here to have the copula, which is realized as a palatal glide after a vowel or as null after a consonant, is completely unacceptable. So you can't say something like Hande anlaymış. That's unacceptable. So in 2 we have finite postcopular. Hande karşıtaymış. Here the copula, the y that we see there, is not only acceptable but obligatory. So we can't say Hande karşıtamış. You have to have that glide, which I've glossed here as copula. So now how about the past tense suffix? It works much the same. Finite postverbal, we have Hande dinledi. Copula is unacceptable, but in postcopular instances, Ali dinlemeliydi. You have to have that copula after the necessitative affix there, meli. So Ali should have listened. So what we get out of this is that in the post-verbal context, the copula is unacceptable. But elsewhere, the copula is obligatory, and by definition, I call those contexts post-copular. So how about, why am I talking about finite in the previous slide? Well, that's because I would be misleading you if I didn't reveal that there are also non-finite varieties of these affixes. So first I'll talk about the non-finite postverbal condition. So we can use mush, the indirect evidential affix, to produce both relative tenses, as I'll call them, and nominal expressions. So here in 5, hande anlamıştı, we have hande had understood. There's no evidential content contributed by that affix here. We simply have a past perfect reading here. Interestingly, the same occurs with nominal expressions. There's no indirect evidentiality contributed. Nasreddin Hoca'yı iyi anlamış biri, someone who understands Nasreddin Hoca well. Here we have something that almost looks like a relative clause, but again, there's no evidential content contributed by that suffix mış. It's simply acting as a perfective aspect marker. The same can be done. You can also create relative tenses using d, but it's a relatively marked form. So in 7 we have hande anladıydı, hande had understood, but you can't create nominal expressions using this simple past marker. That's just not tenable. And it's also important to note that when you take what would otherwise be sort of the post-copular instance, something like hande karşıymış, you can't take that sentence and simply turn it into a past perfect by adding another past tense suffix to the end of the sentence. You can't have a non-finite post-copular use of any of these suffixes. So what's the outcome? We saw in the previous slide that the non-finite d and mış have different interpretations than their finite counterparts. They contribute mış contributes no evidential content, and d contributes no past tense content. They simply serve as perfective markers. So they differ semantically from their finite counterparts. They also differ syntactically. Given the subcategorization requirements illustrated in the previous slide, these suffixes, these non-finite instances can't possibly occupy the same syntactic positions as their finite counterparts. So I conclude from that we can ignore the non-finite counterparts for an analysis of the finite suffixes, and I propose that we treat them as simply distinct lexical items. They mean different things. They occupy different positions. So, back to the finite. Some interesting facts that bear on our project. So, in the post-verbal environment, d and mış are incompatible with stative predicates. So, if you want to say something like she knew Turkish well, Türkçe iyi bildi is infelicitous. If you want to say, in the generic sense, she really loved apples, elma çok sevmiş sounds strange. So we have this incompatibility here with stative predicates. And then also, post-verbal d and mış can both coerce non-stative readings. So when you have the independent verb olmak, to be in Turkish, and you use it in the past tense or with the indirect evidential, you don't get, so for instance in 13 you can't get she was a doctor from doktor oldu. What you get is she became a doctor. So you have a change of state, you have an eventive reading. Same sort of thing in 14, lezzetli olmuş doesn't mean it was apparently tasty, it means something more like, wow, it turned out to be tasty. So what we can conclude from here is that post-verbal d and mış convey perfective aspect, because these are actually, in fact, relatively basic diagnostics. So how about in the post-copular sense? Well, it turns out that post-copular versions of these suffixes are compatible with stative predicates. So here in 15, the sentence that we saw earlier, hande Karş'taymış, hande was apparently in Kars. That's non-stative. Ali öğrenciydi. Ali was a student. Again, stative, I mean, sorry, pardon me. That's stative, and so is 16. We can also construct a number of stative predicates from other TAM markers. So this is a relatively garbled presentation here, but basically the point is that anywhere that you would expect to see a copula present in a Turkish predicate, you can expect to see get a stative reading. And so again, this is a diagnosis of imperfective aspect, which is compatible with stative predicates, as opposed to perfective aspect. So here I have a final diagnostic that illustrates differentiates post-copular and post-verbal suffixes based on their behavior, their interaction with completive adverbials, but I'm actually going to pass over this for the sake of time. We can talk about it if anybody wants to ask. But it's just another diagnostic of perfective and imperfective aspect. So the summary so far, we've established that nonfinite de and mich can be excluded from an analysis of the finite suffixes because they're very likely, we would do well to treat them as distinct lexical items. Also, we've seen that finite postverbal and postcopular de and mich have distinct aspectual readings, or at least that's how it appears. So our question here is, whenever we're fleshing out the semantics and the syntax and semantics of the Turkish verbal spine here, should we treat postverbal and postcopular de and mich as different suffixes, or should we figure out a way to compositionally derive this aspectual distinction? My proposal is that we should be able to treat these as the same lexical items, and we can. So in relatively theory-independent terms, if we'd like a parsimonious account, it should treat a suffix's nonfinite and finite versions as distinct lexical items. On the finite side, it should treat both the postverbal and the postcopular as the same lexical item. And what I'm going to propose is that we treat the finite suffixes themselves as unspecified for aspect. So if these suffixes are unspecified for aspect, what will the lexical items look like? Something like we see in 20 and 21. They occupy what in Hankemer's model of the verbal spine that I showed at the beginning is labeled as tense. And they subcategorize for either a bare verb root or what's called the copula, this thing that alternates with null and palatal glide. But if these suffixes carry no aspectual reading, then where do perfective and imperfective aspect arise? I claim that it arises elsewhere in the verbal projection. So, imperfective by copula. What do I mean by that? Well, simply that the copula itself, this item, in Turkish, is endowed with imperfective aspect. Whenever it's present, we see imperfective aspect. And if we say that imperfective aspect comes with the copula, then we can leave postcopular de and mich unspecified for that. There's some historical support for this idea, and that's that the copula in question, this vanishing glide, actually descends historically from what's now a relatively rarely used bound copula, I. So here in 22 and 23 I have translations of previous examples using this bound copula. Hande karsta imiş, Ali öğrenci idi. Often that form is still sometimes used in Turkish to stress that, oh no, what I said was simple past, or what I said was indirect evidence. So often more of a metalinguistic use now. What's interesting is that Bybee and Dahl in 1989 point out that imperfective aspect markers are often derived historically from copulas. So that's why I wanted to bring that up. So now, where does perfective aspect arise from? Well, my claim is that it arises by default. So here, perfective aspect is really something of an aspectual elsewhere case. If we say that, then postverbal de and mich can remain unspecified for aspect, just like what happens if you attribute imperfective aspect to the copula for the postcopular case. So for clauses otherwise unmarked for aspect, the clause will default to perfective. And here, just like there was some historical evidence for the other claim, we have evidence from imperatives. Imperatives, which are sort of the paradigm case of a bare verb form. In many, many languages, when at least the informal version of an imperative is often just the bare verb. Cross-linguistically, they tend to have perfective aspect. That question might have a deeper explanation, but I think it's interesting to note that either way, that you have this commonality among bare verb forms taking perfective aspect. So now some preliminaries before we get to the denotations themselves. What results from what I've introduced so far is a relatively basic semantic opposition where we have an unmarked aspect, which is perfective, and then we have a marked aspect, which is imperfective. For the cases of this talk, I'm going to assume that the verbal domain denotes an event predicate, and I have sort of a schematic of what I think about the rest of the verbal projection in 25. So we have an event predicate in the verb slot, and what's labeled by Hankemer and others as the aspectual slot, we have what I'm calling other tense, aspect, mood, content, because you actually get a lot more things than simply aspect there, or action, sorry. In the copular slot, we have viewpoint, aspect, as I'm averring, and in tense we have the and mich. So it's important to note that even though I'm calling this thing tense, the indirect evidential also occupies that slot. So the denotations themselves, here if the copular slot is empty, the clause defaults to what I have shown in 26, but when the copula is present, it contributes this imperfective denotation. These expressions really are simply translations of the diagrams I gave at the beginning of the talk, but in sort of mathematical terms, where tau r is your reference time, your arbitrary reference time, and tau e is your event time. So in the perfective case, the event time is contained within the reference time, and in the imperfective case, the reference time is contained within the event time properly. So a summary of what we've seen. Given that we're looking for theoretical parsimony, even before we assemble a perfectly, well-oiled formal account, we can aim for simplicity by minimizing that account's moving parts. And that's what I'm trying to do here. So this account does so by distinguishing elements not by their phonological appearance, but by their syntax and semantics, and by uniting these post-copular and post-verbal affixes. While other accounts, while the account generally follows in this tradition of a generative approach to Turkish morphosyntax, it really gives a general roadmap for any kind of theory of Turkish morphology, and that puts us somewhere between a descriptive grammar and a proper formal account. So looking forward, and these are things that I think are particularly germane here today. There's historical projects that could take this as a starting point or look further into the problem in the area of semantic and syntactic change. So one question is modeling the development of the this copula from the bound copula E, how that works, how it actually, the mechanics of that process. And one could also investigate the development of nonfinite mich. So how did that suffix become a nonfinite aspectual marker from an indirect evidentiality marker? A lot has been written about that already, but it's an interesting topic still. There are also some areal interests here. So in variation, one could examine similar phenomena in genetically related languages, the Turkic languages, but one could also investigate areal diffusion effects. So for instance, looking at Indo-Iranian languages and how they treat perfective aspect and imperfective aspect, what suffixes convey, what structures convey them, and if there's any sort of structural parallels there. There are also some more interesting questions involving simply the concept of a default perfective aspect. One is whether that could be derived from more basic principles, as Bonnemeyer and Swift try to do for what they call a default event realization aspect. One could also look at other bare verb forms beyond the imperative in Turkish. What I mean by bare verb forms is there's no copula to speak of. So these are things besides the imperative, like the conditional bilse, where you take the verb root bil and you add the conditional to it, also described as a correlative by some, or what I think is called oftentimes the optative subjunctive, like bilsin, there, which also has no overt aspectual reading, but things to look at. So some acknowledgements, and yeah, thank you.
Questions? Nick?
Yes, thank you very much. What are your thoughts on the yor suffix?
My thoughts.
Well, your analysis.
Yeah, so that's something I've thought about it a bit. Historically, I think it's an interesting topic. where it's derived from, it's usually treated as either an overt imperfective marker or as an overt progressive marker. The difference between progressive and imperfective I haven't quite come to understand yet. I don't have an analysis of Ior, but it's worth looking at. Yeah.
Okay.
Wow.
Yeah. Do you have thoughts?
Oh, it's an important subject.
What? Yeah. What were your motives in asking that question?
Sometimes questions are real questions.
Okay, so any other questions? Please, Dave. I don't know, I'm not a Turkish expert at all, but I just by the logic of your talk, I mean, one would sort of hope that the same can be extended to the non-finite cases. And I know you tried to convince us that they should be treated completely differently, but don't you think that there might be something similar perhaps available in the non-finite case, maybe?
Like a similarly compositional explanation.
Yeah.
Yeah, I would like to come up with one. So the question is why they lose what I call the core semantics of their finite counterparts. Mm-hmm. So they're basically completely bleached when they occur in non-finite position. How to derive that is a question worth pursuing, but I haven't. So one idea, for instance, is you create a relative tense using the indirect evidential plus simple past. So yaptı, he made something, she made something, or yapmıştı is he had made something, she had made something. One idea is, well, there's some sort of a conflict between indirect evidence specification and the past tense of the simple past suffix. So that clash means that you lose the indirect evidential. I don't know how you would flesh that out in syntactic terms, but that's another possible approach.
But it would be worth pursuing, because I think it's, as much as it's easy to say, oh, we don't need to worry about the phonology much. But this is not like an innocent vowel like as a faint Persian. This is a lot of stuff. Like it's hard
it's
to.
Still only one syllable.
Well, but a lot of a couple consonants and a vowel. So I don't know. I mean, it would be interesting to see if there's something like that. And maybe the way you're looking at it is actually.
I have one more comment on that, and that's in general in descriptive and in theory, this sort of traditional generative approach to this stuff is that these three varieties are all all different lexical items. So not only are the finite and the non-finite distinct, but so are the postverbal and the postcopular. So otherwise, how do we explain these different aspectual readings? So I was trying to do a service by uniting the non-finites, or the finites, but the non-finite remains. Yeah, calling it reanalysis is kind of a cop-out, but.
Okay. Any other questions? No more questions? Okay. Thank you very much.